So now it's time to add a new behavior. We're going to let the player duck. In order to do that, we're going to need to create a new behavior script. So let's go into our scripts folder, behaviors, and create a new C# script called duck. Then let's open this up in Mono Develop. The idea behind our duck script is that we're going to take reference of the Circle Collider attached to the player and shrink it whenever the player ducks. When the player releases the duck button, we'll return the collider to its actual size. In order to do this, first we're going to need to extend our abstract behavior. Then we'll add a few properties to keep track of the collider, the scale, where to offset the collider once we shrink it, and whether the player is actually ducking. We'll start with a public float for scale, and we'll make this 0.5. So basically, we'll divide the size of the collider in half when the player is ducking. Next, we'll add a public boolean to keep track of whether we're actually ducking or not. Also, we'll need another float that'll keep track of the center offset y. This is the position where we'll realign the collider once we shrink it so that we don't see the player jump or move when the collider shrinks. We'll set this to 0. Now we'll need two private properties, one for the Circle Collider 2D, and the other for the center point of the Circle Collider when the script begins. We'll make this a vector 2. Now we're going to override the awake method from our abstract behavior. In order to do that, we'll write protected override void awake, and it's very important that we also call the parent awake. So let's call base awake so that we get reference to the input state, the collider state, and all the other things that we set up in the abstract behavior's awake method. Now, we're going to get a reference to the Circle Collider and its original offset value. Here we'll simply get the component for the Circle Collider, and once we have that, we can get its original offset. This will allow us to reset the value when we're not ducking. Now, let's create a new method called onDuck. Here, we'll have a flag to toggle whether we're ducking or not, and we'll pass it in a boolean for true or false. First, we'll set the current ducking value to the value we supply. Then, we'll get the size of the current collider. Next, we'll set up two variables to store the offset and the size reciprocal, which will allow us to switch between the two different sizes. Next, we'll want to test if we're ducking and also know when we're not. So we'll set up this condition here to test the ducking value. First off, we're going to set up the size reciprocal value to equal scale. Next, we'll create a new offset y, and what we'll do is we'll divide this by 2 and take into account the new offset. Now when we're not ducking, we'll need to reset this. So let's change the size reciprocal back to 1 divided by the scale, which will actually give us the reciprocal of that value, and the new offset y will go back to the original center. Now we can calculate the final size in order to change the Circle Collider. Here we'll calculate the size and multiply it by its reciprocal. Then we'll get the Circle Collider radius and set that to the new size we just calculated. Finally, we'll modify the offset to take into account the change in the values. The last thing we'll need to do is actually trigger onDuck when we detect the input. So in this case, let's get rid of the start method since we're not going to use it. And in update, we're going to create a variable to tell whether the duck key is actually being pressed. Here, we'll say canDuck equals the input state. Here we'll set up a variable to keep track of whether the duck button is being pressed. We'll set up the input state getButtonValue to be the first item in the input buttons array. Then we'll test if we can duck and the collision state is standing and we're not already ducking. We'll call onDuck true. If not, we'll test if ducking and can duck is not true. What's happening here is that we want to make sure that we only reset onDuck to false if we're actually ducking. If not, we'd wind up setting up this size calculation on every update loop, and this would add to some performance impact in our game. At this point, we have everything we need in our duck script. In the next video, we'll attach this to the player, add our duck animation, and test out that everything works.